on Scientists Under Attack, we go now to Jeffrey M. Smith, one of the main contributors of the film and a consummate leading GMO researcher in his own right. Jeffrey, thanks for joining us.
Happy to be here. Well, Scientists Under Attack is an amazing, it's kind of a look at what's happening all over the country and all over the world with scientists who dare to investigate the health dangers or any aspect of genetically modified foods not ordained by big biotech companies like Monsanto.
Right, and I've read that the film itself discusses how most of the studies are generated from Monsanto or other leading GMO producers in the first place. How do we get towards independent science, and how important is that?
Well, independent science for this product, genetically modified crops, is absolutely essential. I mean, we're feeding the products of an infant science to the entire population and planting them outdoors where they cross-pollinate, and the self-propagating pollution of the gene pool is permanent. We have no technology to fully clean it up. So the genes we release today can outlast the effects of global warming and nuclear waste. But if you actually look at the research that they do, it's completely superficial. It's tobacco science. I was talking to Dr. Arpad Pusztai, who's featured in this film, Scientists Under Attack, and he actually was supposed to create the testing protocol for GMOs that was going to be implemented in EU law to evaluate all GMOs approved in Europe. And he discovered that GMOs were inherently unsafe and was fired from his job after 35 years, silenced with threats of a lawsuit. We'll go into that. But I asked him, what was your most shocking moment? And it wasn't being fired from his job. It wasn't discovering the massive damage to the rats that were fed supposedly harmless genetically modified potatoes. The most shocking moment in his life was actually reading the superficial, flimsy studies, and these were his words, superficial, flimsy, poor studies done by the biotech industry, including Monsanto, to get their foods on the market. He said to me, it was a turning point in my life, Jeffrey. I realized what I was doing and what they were doing was diametrically opposed. I was doing safety studies, but these companies, the biotech companies, were doing as little as possible to get their foods on the market as quickly as possible. So he knew that the crops on the market might be causing the same kind of massive damage to his rats, the potentially precancerous cell growth in their digestive tract, smaller brains, livers, and testicles, partial atrophy of the liver, damaged immune system, because he discovered that those problems did not come from the particular gene that was inserted into the potato, but it was based on the generic process of genetic engineering, and that he had used the same process that the biotech industry uses to genetically engineer its foods, and that none of these problems that he found in his rats would ever be discovered and identified in the superficial and flimsy science that they use to get their crops on the market.
Well, if you could elaborate that on a little, I know some of the studies are only 90 days or so, not nearly long enough to show some of the effects. What specifically are we talking about that makes these studies so flimsy and superficial?
Well, yes, the time is one thing. Second, they confound the design to make it really difficult to find something that's statistically significant. I'll give you an example. In Monsanto's 1996 Journal of Nutrition study, which Arpad Pusztai told me that everyone in his team knew it was rigged to avoid finding problems. They basically, and it was other subsequent peer-reviewed studies, have used that as an example of poor science. They diluted the feed, so they only had 1/12 the amount of protein as the GM soy. So there's almost no GM soy in this supposed feeding study. They added too much protein so that any protein inefficiencies or deficiencies would have been masked out. They used older animals instead of the young, fast-growing ones. See, we older adults, we use food mostly as energy, whereas young, fast-growing bodies take the nutrition and form their systems and their organs. And so that's why they use fast-growing young animals in general nutrition studies, and that's apparently why Monsanto chose older animals so they wouldn't show any problem. When they wanted to show compositional differences, they wanted to show that the composition of GM and non-GM were the same, they basically picked crops grown in wide variety of conditions to make as much background noise as possible. You're not supposed to do that. You're supposed to grow in side-by-side equivalent conditions. They had one place that they did that. They referred to it in the study, but completely left out the data. That data was then recovered from the archives of the journal and made public. It turns out the reason why Monsanto did not release the full data from their study was it because it showed that their genetically modified soy, when cooked, had as much as 7 times the amount of a known allergen and about twice the amount of an anti-nutrient, something that blocks the absorption of nutrients. So when they find problems, they leave it out. And when they conduct their studies, they design it so that it's very difficult to find statistical significance. There was one study done by another company. It was Aventis, and they found that twice the number of chickens died when they ate their genetically modified corn. But the study was designed so poorly that even a doubling of the death rate was not statistically significant.
Outrageous. Now talk about some of the findings that have been shown in the independent studies. I know they've been correlated over the years.
Well, let's do it in the terms of scientists under attack, because I think it's interesting to contrast what these scientists have found and the reaction by the biotech industry. We'll start already with Arpad Pusztai, since we're almost there. He took potatoes genetically engineered to produce an insecticide and fed them to one group of rats. A second group of rats got non-GM potatoes, and a third group of rats got non-GM potatoes, plus their diet was spiked with the same insecticide that the GM potato produced. But only the rats that ate the genetically modified potato got hurt. So it was not the insecticide. It was somehow the process of genetic engineering that caused the massive collateral damage in the DNA of the crops, which caused some kind of toxin or some real problem or set of problems in the potato. And when he discovered the issue, he was invited to go on television and speak. He was given permission from his director. And when he spoke on TV, he was a hero at his prestigious institute. The director took over all of the media, declared his research, world-class and life-changing and all that. And then 2 phone calls were placed by the UK Prime Minister's office, forwarded through the receptionist to the director. And the next day, that same director, who the day before was praising Arpad Pusztai, fired him after 35 years and silenced him with threats of a lawsuit. Another study, which was talked about in Scientists Under Attack, Irina Ermakova. She fed genetically modified soy, the same soy grown on 93% of the acreage of soy in the United States, fed soy flour to female rats starting 2 weeks before they got pregnant. More than half of their babies died within 3 weeks. The babies were also smaller and could not reproduce. This compared to a death rate of only 10% when the mothers were fed non-GM soy. So what happened with her is she was immediately attacked by the biotech industry. She released it as preliminary evidence, saying, please repeat this study. It's inexpensive, it's easy, it's shocking, it's astounding. Please provide finances so we can take the preserved organs and do a proper analysis. She never got her repetition. She never got her money. She was vilified. She was set up by Nature Biotechnology, which pretended that she was going to be getting her own essay in their magazine. And what it was a setup so that these pro-biotech scientists could attack her with meaningless criticisms. She told me after we spoke at the EU Parliament that documents were stolen and burnt on her desk. Samples were stolen from her laboratory. One of her colleagues tried to comfort her by saying, well, maybe the GM soy will solve the overpopulation problem. So that's Russia. Now, 5 years later, another senior scientist at the Russian Academy of Sciences also dared to do GMO research on GM soy, feeding GM soy to hamsters over 2 years. By the 3rd generation, most lost the ability to have babies. Some had hair growing in their mouths, and the death rate, the infant mortality rate, was 4 to 5 times. Now, this was supposed to be published 2 months after their announcement in April of 2010, and we haven't seen anything yet. So we're wondering if they've also been stifled. There's other studies. For example, a French team, they actually got hold of the raw data from Monsanto studies, which are usually submitted in secret to regulatory agencies. And so it's complete junk science, but the regulatory agencies are these companies' own minions, and so they just rubber stamp whatever they're given. But these scientists, through a lawsuit and leaked documents, were able to get the actual rat studies that Monsanto conducted on 3 of their corn varieties, when Monsanto said the rats passed with flying colors, but when the scientists reanalyzed the data with proper statistics, they found signs of toxicity in the liver and kidneys. Then they looked at all 19 studies on soy and corn that had been published and found that there were signs of toxicity throughout in the liver and kidneys of rats, and that there was a greater incidence in one organ with males and a different organ with females, suggesting hormonal influences, which can be very serious. And of course, they were attacked. Dr. Seralini was called names by another scientist, and he decided to fight back. What he did is he actually sued the scientist that was attacking him and sued him for libel and won in a French court. Now, most of the attacks that we see are done verbally. They're professional setups. Ignacio Chapella, for example, who's in the film Scientists Under Attack, he was denied tenure and then had to fight back with lawsuits. There was a fake people that were posting things on the internet that actually were traced back to the Monsanto and their PR company. So they were just posting as a fake scientist to try and get trouble for Ignacio Chapella. So most of the attacks are verbal, or they try and get the professional organization to censure the scientists. But there was a physical attack in Argentina, which was just horrible. There was a guy named Andreas Carrasco, and he discovered that Roundup, which is the herbicide by Monsanto, which is used on most of the genetically modified crops, turns out to be related to birth defects. He'd been hearing these stories of the indigenous people being sprayed by Roundup next to the soy fields and complaining of there was a 4-fold increase in birth defects over the decade and a 3-fold increase in cancer. So he took minute amounts of Roundup and injected into embryos of chicken and frogs, and sure enough, they had the same birth defects that were being complained about by these indigenous people. Well, certainly he was attacked verbally, and people showed up, 4 aggressive people showed up at his laboratory and tried to interrogate him. But when he tried to speak in a suburb, actually in a rural area outside of Buenos Aires, an organized group, a mob of about 100, physically attacked him and his party. He was able to make it into his car, and they beat his car for 2 hours. But some of his friends were not so lucky. One was knocked unconscious, and one ended up paralyzed. And this was a horrible experience from someone. He said he wasn't discovering something new. It's been in the literature.
Right.
And yeah.
And we're talking about Scientists Under Attack. It is at the InfoWars store, and it's bundled with your other great work too, Jeffrey M. Smith, as well as films like The World According to Monsanto. Now I want to get into also, let's talk about some of the revolving door issues. People like Michael Taylor from Monsanto inside the U.S. government, at the FDA. How much does that factor into the suppression of these studies, or do you believe that is a factor?
It's a full-court press by the biotech industry on the regulators, on the media, on the academic institutions, on the land-grant universities, on the extension agents. It's completely unprecedented, and they have an amazing power all over the world. It's eroding now, but it's still awesome, and I've seen it as I travel to 33 countries. The role of Michael Taylor is a perfect example, and it explains why we can't trust the FDA in its policies on GMOs. Michael Taylor was in charge of policy at the FDA when their GMO policy came out. So he was the person that directed that policy. And if you read the documents made public from a lawsuit, you can find scientists complaining because every single rewrite of the policy shows that their complaints and concerns about GMOs were systematically removed. And one person said, what's become of this document? It's basically a political document. It has no science in it, and it has no attention to the unexpected side effects. You see, the overwhelming consensus among the scientists at the FDA were that GMOs were inherently dangerous and could create allergies, toxins, new diseases, and nutritional problems. They urged over and over to their superiors to require long-term study. But the policy came out and said, we don't see any real significant difference with GMOs. It's so similar to other foods, no testing is necessary. They said no labeling is necessary. They said companies like Monsanto that make most of the GMOs, they told us that PCBs were safe, they lied. They told us that DDT and Agent Orange were safe, they lied. But now they can tell us whether their GMOs are safe and not even tell the FDA. Now it turns out Michael Taylor was Monsanto's former attorney, and after he presided over the policy, he went to the USDA and worked on biotech issues, and then became Monsanto's vice president. And now the Obama administration put him in as the U.S. food safety czar. So we have the fox guarding the hen house, and we have people from Monsanto telling us that Monsanto will protect us, we should trust Monsanto. However, I talked to one Monsanto scientist, and he's a former Monsanto scientist. He said he saw problems in safety studies on Monsanto's crops. And it was from his friends who were doing the studies. And instead of withdrawing the crops that were causing the harm to the animals, they simply rewrote the study so it would appear to be less harmful. He said 3 of his colleagues at Monsanto were doing safety studies on bovine growth hormone. They found so much IGF-1 in the milk, which is linked to cancer. These 3 scientists refused to drink milk thereafter unless it was organic. One bought his own cow because they refused to eat the products that were affected by Monsanto's own genetically modified drug.
Now, Jeffrey, we know some of these effects can take as long as the 3rd generation to show up in the rat studies. Now, if that happens in humans, is there a plausible deniability for Monsanto and the other responsible parties? What's going to happen when this starts to affect large sectors of the population down the road?
Well, first of all, you're assuming it's going to be down the road. I interviewed a pediatrician this morning, and she's describing new ailments that she hasn't seen before that have been on the rise in the last 10 to 15 years. She's very worried that GMOs are a major contributor to the autism spectrum explosion, to the food allergies, to the enormous problems with digestion in the babies, and in the whole new generation. When GMOs were introduced in 1996, 7% of us in America had at least 3 chronic illnesses, and that jumped to 13% in just 9 years. Reproductive problems have gone up, food allergies have gone up, gastrointestinal problems have gone up. When you look at the animal feeding studies, as the American Academy of Environmental Medicine did, they said these are the problems that are associated with the animals: reproductive problems, immune system problems, accelerated aging, organ damage, gastrointestinal problems, as well as dysfunctional regulation of insulin and cholesterol. So they said all doctors should prescribe non-GMO diets to every patient. But yes, there is deniability built into the system because there's no labeling. So people can't say, I took the non-GM product and I took the GM product and got sick, then I went back to the non-GM product. It's too difficult for that. And that's one of the key reasons why they're so intent on not labeling. Another reason is that they know that most Americans say they would avoid GMOs if they were labeled. And so it would be the death knell of GMOs if labeling comes about.
Wow. Well, I know there's so much more to talk about, but we thank you for joining us for now. The film is Scientists Under Attack, and it's at the InfoWars online store, along with a lot of other powerful anti-GMO information.